Hey folks, welcome to the 6th and final installment of Loom-in-essence, where we adventure through the world of experimental loom-based beadwork. I'm Shine, your host. Now, if you've been watching these videos, you know that I usually follow a format where I introduce the concept for the artwork, and then I talk about the construction of the piece, and then at the end I talk about the takeaways and what I learned from the piece and how I'll apply it going forward. But this time we're going to do things a little bit differently. I'll get to all of that, but before I do, I want to give you a little update that relates to the last piece that I did because it feels relevant and I feel like it'll help us come full circle to this piece. Now, if you've been following along with my journey, you'll know that 8.5 months ago, I had surgery. And before I had surgery, I worked on and completed a piece called Letting Go, which explored themes around death and dying, but more specifically around dying prematurely and going through the emotional journey of examining your life choices and feeling like maybe you have less time left than you thought, and accepting that, and also just making the best of the time you do have left, and seeing death approaching and acknowledging it and emotionally preparing yourself for it. Now, I thought that this piece was related to my own reckoning with my mortality, which was triggered by my health challenges, which seemed logical at the time, but there was a very strong emotional direction associated with this piece that didn't quite fit with my reality, unless I was dying and didn't know and maybe intuitively was sensing something. But I didn't know at the time that my father, my biological father, was terminally ill and dying, and since then has passed away. It's been about 6 months now. And so we've been estranged for most of my life. And so I wasn't aware that he was going through this, but as soon as I found out, immediately in my mind, I made this connection between the piece that I was creating or had created, and perhaps his emotional experience and journey as it related to his end of life. So I guess it's impossible to say whether or not through this piece of art I was somehow connecting to his emotional experience or channeling it. But for me, in my mind and in my heart, there does feel like there is that connection. And of course, for this project, death has been a constant theme. So at the beginning of the project, I would say during the first week, actually, my grandfather passed away, who I'd been caring for the last 2.5-3 years. And now at the end of this project, my father passed away. So the last piece in this series, of course, also deals with death. So earlier in the series, I was working with a piece that consisted of multiple looms. And so I've come back to that piece. The piece is called The Other Side. The other side referring to where people go when they cross over, when they die. And the first two pieces in this larger piece were the void and the veil. And the last piece, which is what this video is going to be about, is called The Light. Let's talk about the conceptual theme. So this piece is called The Light, and in case it's not obvious, when I'm talking about the light I mean is the light that people report seeing at the time of death. And so I needed a visual idea that could hold that grandness, that greatness, because it's not just the light, it's the light, if you know what I mean. So I played around with some different visual ideas, like light at the end of the tunnel, or using the imagery of a sunset with the rays of light coming through the clouds. I also played around with an abstract version where I created rings of different colored light around the center light. But ultimately, all of these fell short of what I was trying to capture. And in the end, I decided to go with a space aesthetic. And so I had a celestial body of light that was bursting forth from a galactic spiral of color against a black or dark backdrop. And the reason I went with this is because I felt like the darkness of the space really embodied the vastness of the unknown and of all the unknown that surrounds death and the other side. And then the light presented in this way had a grandness about it. It felt powerful and all-encompassing and overpowering, but in this beautiful way. And I hope that when you look at the image, you'll know what I mean. Like, I hope that it creates a visceral, emotional response. And it's hard to explain exactly the feeling, because I'm not sure there is a word for that. Or maybe there's a word and I just don't know it. But I think maybe awe is the closest adjective I can find right now. All right, let's talk about the construction of the piece. So this piece was actually significantly more complicated than the pieces I've created so far in the series. So there were many different elements to consider, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to focus on the 4 areas where I had additional challenges to find solutions to, and that really build on the complexities that I've explored so far through this series. So the first one is for calculating the distance between the warp threads. I had the additional challenge this time of using a variety of beads. Now, all the beads that I was using were Delicas by Miyuki, and they were all 11.0 Delicas, so same brand, same size. However, just because they're the same brand and the same size on the label does not mean they are actually the same size. And I've learned this just through experience. So most of the beads that I was using were silk Delicas, and that just means that the material that they're made out of is a slightly different kind of material, and the cut on the beads is a little bit different. So that translates into these beads being a little bit bigger, and I needed to calculate how much bigger they were. And it worked out to about 2.5% bigger than the regular Delicas. So I needed to account for this when I was calculating the distance between my warp threads and make sure I had enough of a buffer so that they could accommodate these slightly larger beads. The next thing I had to do was, well, if you look at the frame, it's a really weird shape. So I had to figure out how to work with not only the angle, which now at this point I know how to do, but this is an angle that basically turns into a curve. So I needed to find a solution that would allow me to keep my warp threads equidistant so that I wouldn't have any rippling or buckling in my piece. And I'd never done this before, but the first solution that popped into my head was using additional wraps around the anchor beads to space them out more. Now, when I'm approaching a problem that I've never encountered before when it comes to art and construction, usually what I do is I just visualize the piece in my head and then I look at it, like the completed piece. And I look at it, and then from there I try and see how I can rebuild that on the outside world, or in the outside world. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's just my personal artistic process and way of problem solving. And that's how I figured this piece out. So I decided to give it a go and to try using additional wraps around the anchor beads when I was coming up towards the curve. So in the beginning, for the angled part, I was just doing 1 wrap between each bead, and then when it started to curve, I did 2, and then as I went deeper into the curve, I did 3, and then eventually 4 wraps, spacing those anchor beads out more and more. And then I just started to string the warp threads, and it seemed to be working quite well until I got to the end, and I realized that I hadn't made those last wraps quite tight enough. I thought that it would be okay and that maybe having a little bit of give would allow me the flexibility of making those last minute adjustments, but actually it worked against me, and I found that I had less control and like the spacing was not as even as I needed it to be. So I had to take it out, which is what happens sometimes when you're creating experimental pieces. Sometimes your idea works partially and not fully. Sometimes it doesn't work at all. And you have to take a step back. So I redid it, and this time I made my wraps really, really, really tight. And I strung my warp threads and it worked. So that was awesome. The next thing I needed to figure out was the weaving pattern. So throughout this series, I've explored different types of weaving patterns. And for this piece, I went back to the concept that I used for the first piece. Only in the first piece, I was going in a spiral motion. And for this piece, I decided I still wanted to have those two weft threads together instead of having one and like sewing it through the beads and then sewing it back through the same row. Instead, I would just have two separate threads so that I could always be moving in one direction, and then I would have the two threads zigzag. So this allowed me to be able to load on as many beads as I wanted. So this piece is quite large and it is patterned, and I have to pay attention to what beads are going where and what colors. And it was just so much easier and faster for me to be able to do chunks of maybe 20 beads, 30 beads, 15 beads at a time instead of having to figure out all 90 beads or 100 beads in one go. And the last component was figuring out how to get this visual idea onto the loom. So the first thing I did is I created a digital painting on my iPad, of course. And then that part was fairly easy, but now translating that digital artwork into a physical loomed piece was not as easy. My first attempt involved me taking a grid. I created a grid based on my measurements of the warp threads and the size of the beads. And I put that on top of my image on my iPad, and I decided I'll just like count the beads down for every row and translate them into the loom that way, just like picking the correct colors and putting them in the right place. This technically worked. However, it was incredibly slow. It was really hard to keep track of like where I was, especially during the longer rows. So this was a no-go for me. I got part of the way through and then I started again. Again, this is sometimes part of the process. But I was stuck, and I knew that I did not have enough time to keep going the way I was. I had to find a faster way to do it. And so I decided to print out the image, and I cut it out to be small enough to fit inside the frame of the loom. I backed it with a piece of cardboard, and then I just like loosely sewed it to the loom in a way that I would be able to remove after. And then I just looked at the piece and picked the beads to sew onto the loom, and it was much, much, much faster. And when I say much faster, bear in mind that this one loom took maybe 100 hours to create, so not that fast, but definitely faster than I was going with the other technique. So this worked well enough. Halfway through, I flipped the piece over, I printed out the mirror image of the design, and I put it on the other side. And I continued working with the piece until it was complete. All right, time for the takeaways. So first of all, it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyways. Anchor beads must be anchored down really well, really tightly, especially when you're working with a loom frame where the sides are on an angle. It's much easier to work with them when there's no give than when there's even a little bit of give, because it gets hard to control where that give is gonna go when you're working with the warp threads. Number two, for working with large pieces like this, I found it much easier to work with a printout of the image that I was creating as opposed to just working off the screen. Now, in the past, for smaller patterns, I have been able to work off the screen really easily, especially if I code all the colors, but for this, there was just too much going on, and the rows were very long. So printing it out was a huge help, and in future, I would not make the original artwork in RGB. I didn't know I was going to print it out, otherwise I wouldn't have done that, but now I'll know for next time. And lastly, I'd just like to acknowledge how successful and how incredible this piece was, and that it was only possible because of all the work that I did on the pieces leading up to this piece. Like, those pieces really allowed me to deepen my practice, to develop new skills, to adapt my techniques and refine them and experiment with them and apply them in new ways. And it was all that learning and growth that really allowed this piece to come into being and be as incredible as it is. So as an artist, as a human who is finding creative solutions to things in life, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, you know, sometimes having a dedicated practice can make all the difference and surprise you with what it allows you to accomplish down the road. Okay, so it is that time. Before I end, I would like to say that I am forever grateful to the Canada Council for the Arts for their support in making this project possible. It has been an honor, and this piece would not exist without this funding. So Canada Council for the Arts, thank you so much. I also want to thank my viewers. Thank you for coming along on this journey with me. It's been a pleasure. And as always, if you have feedback, questions, comments, please leave them in the comments. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. Okay, until the next time, bye for now.